Thank you for tuning in to the Practical Preservation Podcast. Please take a moment to visit our website, practicalpreservationservices.com, for additional information and tips to help you restore your historical home. If you've not done so, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, and also like us on Facebook. Welcome to the Practical Preservation Podcast, hosted by Danielle and Jonathan Kepperling. Kepperling Preservation Services is a family-owned business based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, dedicated to the preservation of our built architectural history for today's use as well as future generations. Our weekly podcast provides you with expert advice specific to the unique needs of renovating a historic home, educating by sharing our From the Trenches preservation knowledge and our guests' expertise, balancing modern needs while maintaining the historical significance, character, and beauty of your period home.
Today on the Practical Preservation Podcast, I have Marc Howard Ross with us from, he's the author of Slavery in the North, Forgetting History and Recovering Memory. And anybody who's listened to the podcast knows that I often reference it as a preservation book. So thank you, Marc, for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So tell me a little bit about your background.
I'm a political scientist by training. And I've worked in a lot of different countries over the years. I taught at Bryn Mawr College for 46 years until I retired a few years ago. And I have looked at a lot of different cultures and people. And one of the exciting things about being able to do what I've done is that I could study new projects as I came along. I never thought I was going to do this book on slavery.
Right. So what led you to begin studying slavery, and specifically slavery in the northern colonies and states?
Well, the story is that I finished a book that I published in 2007, looking at different places in the world, including the United States, that have had intense conflicts around cultural issues. Cultural issues meaning ones that don't necessarily have intrinsic meaning in terms of power, like money and land and whatnot, but represent things to people where they fight bitterly. For example, language disputes. Canada has had really a hard time. It's less now, but about English versus French as the national language, and Quebec had to ban English in many places. But that's also true in other parts of the world as well. In Spain, two areas in particular have wanted to make and have made local languages spoken by millions of people official languages along with Spanish. And that's produced tremendous problems in those regions, particularly the Catalans now in the eastern part of Spain. I've looked at the things like the holy sites in Jerusalem, and why is it that these sites produce so much tension, anger, and wars?
Right.
And what's behind it? There's always something behind these situations that I call identity. It's people's group identity and who they are. And groups that feel, or people that feel their identities are at risk and threatened, get very upset. And so those kinds of conflicts are often very difficult to resolve.
Right.
And many of them don't get resolved. I looked at the controversy that dragged on for decades in the American South about the Confederate flags, Confederate battle flags that were part of state flags in
Right.
South Carolina, in Georgia, in Mississippi, and those produced ongoing conflicts that are now in a different place than they were. But it certainly was not something that was resolved very quickly. And even now, there are people angry about those things. We can see fights. I didn't spend a lot of time in those projects looking at monuments.
Oh, yeah.
Monuments. I mean, now all the stuff in the South about monuments, and in a city like Philadelphia, where I live, we've got tons of Civil War monuments, and nobody gives a damn. I've taken students to see
Right.
them, and they say, "What is that? Why do we
Right.
have that?"
Nobody even stops to read the plaque.
No. On the Parkway in Philadelphia, there's the war to the monuments to the Civil War soldiers who fought from here. You ask people, "What's that?" I say, "I don't know. It's a piece of stone or something."
Right.
And it's a big thing. I went to South Africa because I was particularly interested in South Africa after there was the change in the transformation of power in the 90s. I
Right.
went in the early 2000s and asked what happened to the monuments and the memorials and the museums that dominated South Africa, and they were all white and often only Afrikaner. And what happened when power shifted in South Africa. And it was really very interesting. They didn't destroy most of them. They didn't change most of them. What they did is they added to what I call their sacred landscape. And by addition, they for a time were very successful.
And was that so? Did they retain the monuments that were there and just added other context or things like that? Is that how they handled it in South Africa?
They did different things. Sometimes they would build a new site. For example, on Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela and the people in the ANC were imprisoned for so long, they turned that into a historical site where you can go visit, and there's a tour of that. Mm-hmm. They had museums. They've changed some exhibits in the museums. They built new museums. They built new monuments. And so they used addition rather than destruction. It wasn't like the former Soviet Union that they just knocked down all the old statues of Lenin and Stalin. I think,
I was just going to say, I'm not, this is not my area of expertise, but just based on my recollection of history, it seems like that's probably more typical to like just knock down the statue and like move on. Is that your understanding also?
Well, there are different things in Hungary, starting I think in the late 19th century, when regimes changed, they took the statues of the former rulers, and they put them in a park in the city in Budapest. So you can go see literally dozens and dozens of statues of people who were important in the past, but they didn't destroy them. But they don't leave them out on the street where they once were.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So different societies do different kinds of things in terms of remembering the past or forgetting the past.
So tell me about your book, The Slavery in the North, Forgetting History and Recovering Memory.
So how I got into that, when I was finishing the previous book, less than a mile from my home, I learned about the site on Independence Mall, which is a block from the Libertyville. A historian had found the records of the building that was built on the corner of 6th and Market Street.
Right.
But the building was destroyed in the 1830s. It was the building in which George Washington lived when he was president of the United States. And research showed that he had brought 9 enslaved people from Mount Vernon
Right.
in Virginia to live with him and work as his, I don't call them servants,
No.
his slaves
Yeah.
in the president's house. And all kinds of people were saying, how's that possible? It couldn't have happened in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was part of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was a free state.
Yeah, we had the gradual abolition.
Yeah, well, it turned out that Pennsylvania didn't end slavery in the state until 1845.
Right.
So it was very gradual, but people didn't recognize that. They said the Quakers were here. And then I would say to people, hey, listen, the Quakers were here and there were Quaker abolitionists, but guess what? In the 18th century, until the beginning of the American Revolution, the Quakers, who were a wealthy group, were among the largest slaveholders in Pennsylvania.
Right.
So it's not quite as simple as, oh, Quakers, we couldn't have had slavery.
Right.
So I got interested in the story behind it, and there were demands by not just African American groups, but groups of historians to do something significant to recognize the existence of slavery in Washington's home on the Mall. And it produced a lot of intense feelings about what should be done, what should be said, what should not be said, what should, what money should be spent. And it took a long time. And the meetings that I went to, as I became interested in studying this, grew very intense at times. And it was not just black-white.
Right.
There were blacks who wanted to get rid of all kinds of stuff, and others who wanted to put up a memorial, and people who said, hey, listen, George Washington can be learned about all over the country. This should be just a site of slavery, and hell with George Washington. And other people said, no, you got to tell both stories.
Right.
So I went to meetings. There was a group called Avenging the Ancestors Coalition. After I spoke to them for the first time, they invited me to attend their meetings, and they're held once a month. And it was very interesting to hear their perspectives and to attend events and what they did was really very innovative in terms of developing new ways of memorializing what had happened. They developed, in effect, some holidays. So, for example, George Washington's birthday is February 22nd.
Right.
It's been celebrated by school kids throughout this country for decades. And it turned out that on his birthday in 97, excuse me, his former chef, who had lived in the house in Philadelphia almost this whole time here, ran away from Mount Vernon. And so this group decided that they would now celebrate this as Hercules, which is his name, Hercules Freedom Day. And that's a very clever kind of thing. So they would meet down at the site of the where the house was in Philadelphia, and have a couple of speeches and talk about George Washington wasn't such a great guy because he owned 316 enslaved people in his lifetime. And so there were a lot of things involving school kids, involving adults, involving various groups around the city. So it became a very interesting thing that grew over the period from 2002, when the house was first identified by this historian, and the Inquirer ran a long story about it. And 2010, when the site was first opened to the public. So, so I got interested in that, but then the next piece, and I'll make this much shorter, was, hey, I grew up in New York City. I went to public schools there, and I didn't ever learn about slavery in the North.
Right.
And there were 20,000 enslaved people in New York City on the eve of the American Revolution. What the hell happened? Was I sick the one day that they talked about it? You know, and so I gradually began to be interested in other sites where slavery occurred in the North. I visited many places with my wife in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New York, and New Jersey, and developed a much better sense. And I was not a historian by training, and I learned about slavery in the North by reading the work of many historians who worked in detail over decades, sometimes going to the archives, some reading old colonial newspapers, some finding court cases, and telling the story of enslaved people, people who searched for freedom, people who escaped, people who escaped and were captured. So it's a complicated story.
Yeah, it is. And I agree that I think that the majority of the history lessons that were taught, even when I was in school, glossed over the fact that it was all across the country. It was not just in the southern states, because then you talk about the slavery, you talk about the Civil War, and then it's over.
Yeah, no, it disappeared.
Yeah.
But the North developed a belief that it was only a Southern problem.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a denial of what happened here.
Right.
And New York City, for example, was a home. As I said, it was the largest enslaved population in a city in the United States or in the colonies, except for Charleston, South Carolina. And there was a big controversy in New York starting in 1991, when the General Services Administration wanted to build an office building in Lower Manhattan. It's a couple of blocks from where City Hall is now, and it's just north of Wall Street.
Right.
And they had to do an excavation. And so they said, well, we're not going to really find very much, because this whole area, which was right off Broadway, has been built and rebuilt for almost 2 centuries. So, we got to do the dig, so we'll dig. Well, what it turned out is that when they began this, they realized they found the map, and they weren't clear what exactly had happened, but because on the map it showed, it said African burial ground. Actually, it said Negro burial ground. Right. And so, as part of the preparation for this dig, they did radar to see what there was, and they started digging, and they found remains of formerly enslaved people as deep as 25 feet down.
Oh my goodness.
In fact, they were intact, because no buildings in Manhattan went that far down in that part of Manhattan. And what the story is that the area given to the Black population in New York for burying the dead was outside the walls of the city. So it was north of Wall Street. It was against the law to bury people inside the city. So where's this land? This land is swampy. It gets shocking.
It's land nobody else wanted.
Nobody else could use it.
Right.
So what happened in the 19th century as Manhattan becomes populated, they filled it all in. That's why there's 25 feet of soil.
There's pressure, yeah.
And so there was demand. Again, let's do something about this. And it isn't until 2006 that this becomes a site, a national park site, and a memorial site. It's a very interesting place with a great visitor center showing films and having a lot of artifacts from this period. And there was tremendous conflict again about what to do and how to do it. In fact, the General Service Administration said, we got to finish this dig. And oh, by the way, they'd estimated that there were 15 to 20,000 people interred under the ground there.
Oh my goodness, that's huge.
Yeah, that's a lot. But there were a lot of people who had been enslaved and some free in New York. New York first had enslaved people living in it under the Dutch in 1626. So it's got a long history of this.
Right.
And anyway, finally, the agreement is reached because a lot of people in the Black community got upset about digging up the remains and not really caring for them in ways that they considered proper. So finally, they decide to not dig anymore, and they hired a team of forensic anthropologists from Howard University to examine the remains. That took a long time, and they learned an awful lot about the conditions of these people. And needless to say, these people lived under very difficult circumstances. The bones were not great, just all kinds of evidence of disease. And over half of the remains that they dug up were kids under 3. So they weren't living very long in the 18th century if they were living under those conditions. So finally, they finished the examinations in Washington, which is very interesting. And then there's the decision to reinter them in the site in New York as part of the memorial that's being built. They get carriages to carry them back with coffins, and they stop at African-American churches in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Newark, and in New York for ceremonies. And then they hold a public ceremony to rebury them in the what's now the African Burial Ground, which is a very interesting site. Unfortunately, it's not highly visible, and you have to know you want to go there. And if you know you want to go there, you can find it with no problem. So that's one of the places I went, and I went to New Hampshire. New Hampshire had enslaved Africans living in it from 1646. That's a long time.
That is.
And again, they found some remains and reburied them and had a very moving ceremony in the city of Portsmouth, which was the capital for a long time. So by traveling around and visiting sites, you can really learn about what happened there.
Right. Well, and something that I took away from your book was that the burial sites really became a way to document, because all the other maybe places were not preserved. And so this was a way to document that there really was slavery in the northern states.
Well, as you know, the subtitle, the book is Recovering Memory.
Right.
And one of the ways in which this is done is finding places on the landscape, sacred grounds, or not so sacred grounds, but where enslavement occurred. And burying sites, as you mentioned, burying grounds in New England, cemeteries here, become very important. And in Pennsylvania now, there are groups of people who meet every fall, and they talk about what they're doing to clean up former burying grounds that are overgrown, that have stones that are kind of half buried,
Right.
and how to clean them up, and how to turn these into memorials for communities large and small. In Philadelphia, there's a conflict that's gone on since 2011. There's a park, playground, excuse me, in South Philadelphia, that was 6 blocks south of the founding AME church in the country. They needed a place where they could inter people, because their burying grounds on the property were tiny, and the
Right.
city refused to let them bury people in the city. And in that period, in the early 19th century, the boundary of Philadelphia was on South Street. Now it's
Okay. Yeah.
way further south of that. So they bought this land, and there's a historian, freelance historian, named Terry Buckaloo, who begins to learn about this burying ground and starts to do research on it. And one of the things he does, he goes to City Hall to look at their burial records. And the estimates now, since archaeologists have done some research, is there between 5,000 and 7,000 or 8,000 people who were buried in this very small area. They were
Right.
stacking the,
Right.
the people on top of each other. And he was able to turn up the names and a little bit about 2,500 of them. And he's published this, and he's got a website where he tells a story of different people on different days. And so now, then there was a demand from several Black groups
Right.
to build some kind of memorial and whatnot. And there was conflict because some of the people in that neighborhood didn't want the playground to be destroyed. It's in fact, the playground is bigger than the burial site, but they finally come to some agreement, and there's a plan now, there's the money, and they are putting something up here. And so you find this throughout the North. People are uncovering in small towns, in cities, in neighborhoods, former burying grounds where free and earlier enslaved African Americans are interred. So that's becomes a very important way in which you can tell the story of these communities. That, along with the research historians and others are doing, freelance people often telling the story because they go back to their town records.
That that kind of brings me, I guess, to talking to you about the concept of collective memory, because I think that was one thing that I really hit me when I was reading the book, that people die, people move away, and we lose some of that history, we lose some of that memory if it's not memorialized in some way.
Well, I talk about 3 ways in which it becomes important. One that I've been talking about now is something on the landscape,
Right.
which is identified with the past and becomes part of the memory. There were also stories, narratives, I call them, but they're stories that people tell. They tell them within families, they tell them in communities, they tell them in larger collectivities. We have national narratives, but very local ones. So those need to be told, and they are told much more effectively when there are places on the landscape where you can point to. And then thirdly, there are rituals and reenactments and events that occur on these spot places where the stories are told to the community, sometimes just in families, sometimes in much larger groups. And that's a way in which collective memories are told.
And so, what, why or how is memory forgotten? What, what leads to that?
Well, I have a list of things that I've come up with, but I would not claim that this is these are the only ways. That'd be arrogant. Um, the simplest thing is memory declines over time.
Mhm.
And unless they're renewed, people forget things. You ask me about things 50 years ago, what did I have for dinner on this date in 1960? I don't know what I had. I don't know where I was. So that's a very normal process by which communities and people forget things. In fact, we'd be crazy if we had to remember everything.
Right.
But secondly, the destruction of significant sites in the landscape. We know about urban renewal.
Right.
We've knocked down all kinds of things. We've covered them over. This cemetery that I was describing to you was sold to the city, and the city didn't do anything with it. And then the city built this playground over the land. And those kinds of stories occur, so that when buildings or sites are destroyed, they're no longer repositories of memory.
Right.
In addition, there are incentives for forgetting and remembering at times. Trauma. If you talk to a lot of war vets from Vietnam or World War II, if you can find one now, or conflicts in more recent conflicts, vets don't like to talk much about their service.
Right.
I mean, there are a few who do, but for many, there's too much pain and suffering. And so I had people in my family who were veterans in World War II. They didn't tell war stories.
No.
They might have a picture of when they were in a uniform. So it's too painful. And so you avoid the topic. And in addition, sometimes there's social sanctions against remembering things. And if you start to tell stories, you get punished.
Right.
You get punished emotionally, or in fact in other ways. Painful memories promote forgetting.
Right.
It's much easier to walk away, and we all do that at times.
Right.
There's also shame and guilt for individuals and groups about the past.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that's interesting to me is certainly whites in the North are very ashamed about the story of slavery, especially if it's connected to their families.
Right.
And
yeah, I've experienced that also. I've done some research on slavery in Lancaster County, and there's still some families around that are direct descendants of the families.
Sure.
And they don't want to even associate with it. And it's hard. Yeah.
My stepdaughter found a family tree from her father's side.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out in Virginia in the 1850s, that family owned some enslaved people.
Yes.
She teaches a course at the University of Rochester around some of these topics of memory. And the first day she tells her students, this was in my family.
Uh-huh.
And some of them just like freak out. How can you tell us this and whatnot? And she said, it's important that we share these kinds of things, but it's not easy to do. And we see this in the South as well as in the North. People just want to avoid that. There's a lot of shame on the part of whites if they may have had ancestors who were slaveholders. And there's a lot of guilt on the part of some African Americans that their ancestors didn't fight and try to kill whites.
Right.
Well, it's pretty tough to do when you're in a position of being basically imprisoned And so if you're feeling those things very strongly, shame or guilt, you just repress,
Right.
and that's a way of forgetting. And then a last thing is we have a way as humans to reframe the past with new narratives. We develop new stories about them. New Englanders. There's a book about New England. What did they do with the native peoples who were in, say, Massachusetts and Rhode Island? And one of the things that they did is develop a story, a narrative that they told each other that the land was empty when they came.
Yeah.
Well, part of that story was, well, there were some people around, but they didn't know how to use it anyway. So we took it.
Yeah.
And there's also the lost cause narrative in the South that develops in the 1870s and 80s and 90s about how white Confederates developed the story that they lost the war. And it's the cruelty of the Northerners. They had a bigger army, but we had a real cause. We were better fighters, and that's where a lot of the Confederate stuff begins. It's a memorial. That's right. The statues don't go up until the 1890s or 1900s.
Okay. Yeah.
So that becomes very important as you develop new stories about the past that slides over, what happened. And, the whole notion of, the enslaved people were treated better by us. They got Christianity. They lived better than they would have in Africa. So it really wasn't that bad. That's been said for decades.
Right.
So those are ways in which forgetting what actually happened can occur.
And then, and the reason that I think that when I read your book, I thought this is really a preservation book, is when you talk about tying landscapes and objects into the history as a tool for remembering. So can you talk to me a little bit about how having those touchstones helps people to remember the history and remember the past?
Well, there are a variety of things that can occur that do that. One obvious way is not sufficient, but introducing these things into school curriculum,
right?
Telling kids early.
Yeah.
And I went to public school in New York City that was named after a figure from the Revolutionary period, whose family, not him, but his direct ancestors were slaveholders.
Right.
That was never. No one told that kind of story. So there's that. There's also, as I say, building something on the landscape in communities, sometimes small, sometimes large, passing these kinds of stories on to kids as they grow up. And I know some African Americans who told me that when they asked their ancestors at family events to tell the story about slave times and what they heard, sometimes people say, we don't want to talk about that. It's not for you. Well, that's blocking this. So so now, as people are more willing to tell these stories, just go to television, just go to movies, go to books.
Right.
We've got a lot more that's publicly available. We can talk more about those periods. It's not that things are really easy talking, especially between whites and blacks, about those years,
right.
But we've broken through a little bit.
And I think the remembering and telling the history are very, very important. And acknowledging the history, not trying to to gloss over or whitewash it. Just the facts are the facts, and we don't have to try to change that narrative.
Yeah, and it's as small as family history and as large as national history, and everything in between.
Yeah, I really agree with that. How do you think that memory should be sustained over time, or how can they be? Is that, building the landscape and teaching, is that kind of tied in with that?
Well, my view is that it's really up to individual groups and communities to decide what to remember and how to do it. And so I think that people are very creative, much more creative than any one person is.
Right.
And so those people will come up with various kinds of methods. And just seeing what's gone on in the last 25 years is striking, because more has been done than anyone thought was possible 30 years ago or 40 years ago.
Yeah, I agree.
And some of it's the work of professional historians, some of it's movies. A movie like 10 Years a Slave, 12 Years a Slave,
Right.
tells a story that was replicated in many ways.
Right.
There were slave catchers who came up north, and they were capturing any Black person they could and selling them down south. And so that suddenly becomes something we're aware of.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. And I see a shift in preservation with wanting to tell a more inclusive story. So we're saving these big house, the big that's not the right word, house museums. I wanted to call it a house mansion. I'm like, that's the wrong M word. My brain needed to come up with it. But these house museums where you just told the story of, the person who the house was built for and their life, but now they're telling the story of the people who were enslaved there or worked there, all the stories of all the people. And I think that's really important, because then it allows people. That was one other thing I took from your book, that allows people to see themselves in the history, so that making the history more inclusive.
Sure, and visiting sites, and they're all over the North now, is very impressionable on people, and say, and we're opening more sites. So. But sites, stories, ceremonies, rituals that occur in these places, and museums are starting to tell the stories.
Right.
Look, a generation ago, even the work of Black artists was often not presented in public museums.
That's true. Yeah.
And now that's it's changing. I'm not saying it's all better, but I am saying it's different.
Yeah, it is different, and the narrative is changing. It's
my grandkids' experiences and how they think about this can be totally different than mine, which is great.
And I agree with you. I mean, I'm even my age, I see people that are in their early 20s, and they are much more open than even I am to like different people and different stories. And not that I'm terrible, but I was raised by a different generation of people.
Absolutely. No, that's having places that are what I'll call prestigious places where the people can go. The new museum in Washington, the African American Museum of Culture and History and Culture, is terrific. To take classes to take families to, and this is right on the mall, and right next to the Washington Monument, close to the Lincoln Memorial. That's really important in terms of legitimating these stories.
It is, yeah, very, very much so. And we kind of talked early on about projects that you were involved in that, that connect the past with the present. Is there anything else maybe that you wanted to discuss about that, or do you feel like you covered it when we kind of talked about the different projects that you featured in the book?
Well, it's interesting you ask, because this week I've been watching a thing online, which is about Atlantic slavery, and it's a series of events. Each day they're doing a thing. It's not Zoom, but it's equivalent to Zoom,
Right.
where people in Britain and in the Caribbean and in the United States
Right.
are talking about ways to understand how slavery was a complicated process. So one of the things I learned in this whole thing was that in the 1700s and 1800s, the ties between parts of the North and the Caribbean were very powerful.
Oh, yes.
Why? Because you could go on a boat and get either, back and forth much more easily than if you had to travel by land. Right. So there were farms in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Long Island, the Hudson River Valley, a little bit in New Jersey, where crops and animals were grown that were transported to places like Jamaica, where they were used to feed the enslaved people on the sugar plantations. Why? Because the people in Jamaica wanted to plant as much sugar as possible.
Right. They want to maximize. Yeah.
And the movement back and forth. For example, Martha Washington, who marries George Washington, her first husband has a big plantation in the Caribbean. And she, in fact, inherits from his death more enslaved people than Washington ever had on his own. And there are all kinds of stories between connections. It's not far from, Jamaica is not, or Barbados is not that far from the South, especially.
That's true. And I just learned last week, along a similar line, is that Alexander Hamilton was born in the Virgin Islands.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a lot of trade and connection between the Caribbean and the continental United States.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I continue to sort of explore this, because it's not something I spent a lot of time on until recently.
Yeah, it is, as you dig in, though, I find that with some of the research that I do, you just kind of get sucked in. You want to learn more.
Well, listen, visiting West Africa, which I did in the 1960s, and seeing the places where people who were captured to be sold into slavery were kept in Ghana, what's now Ghana or Senegal, is also very moving.
Oh, yeah.
And those countries are starting to tell the stories there, because there, a lot of the capturing of people was not done by whites who came over,
right,
but it was done by Black groups fighting with other Black groups.
The warring tribes.
Yeah.
Did as we're getting ready to wrap up a little bit, or do you is there something that maybe you thought about that you wanted to share that I didn't ask you before we finish?
Not now, but
okay.
I might think.
It always comes later. That's what always happens to me. I'm like, oh, I should have said that.
I go in different directions with this.
So tell me, where can someone purchase your book?
Thank you.
Oh, where can someone purchase your book?
Oh, Amazon.
Okay, on Amazon. Okay, and is there a way that you would that listeners could contact you if they were curious or wanted to talk to you about something?
Sure, I have an email.
Okay, sure.
Marc, M-A-R-C, .Ross, R-O-S-S, 66 @gmail.com.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed our conversation. I appreciate it.
I did too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Preservation Podcast. The resources discussed during this episode are on our website at practicalpreservationservices.com/podcast. If you received value from this episode and know someone else that will get value from it as well, please share it with them. Join us next week for another episode of the Practical Preservation Podcast. For more information on restoring your historic home, visit practicalpreservationservices.com.